Hi everyone, thanks for coming early this morning. We're going to just start the session on lizards today, and I'll just let Ying Tong introduce himself. Yeah, thanks.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my talk. It's titled Tales of Dragons and Worms, the Lizards of Singapore and the Region. So a little bit about me before I think this clip is having a problem again. So a little bit about me before I begin the talk. I am a zoology graduate from the University of Reading. I currently work as a freelance fauna specialist, meaning I look into reptiles and amphibians for environmental impact assessments. And my research interests include taxonomy, ecology, and bioacoustics. So bioacoustics is basically the study of sounds made by animals, and I specifically focus on calls produced by frogs. And actually I did a talk on that as well, if you want, it's online. So today we will be talking about a few things in general. So firstly, we'll be discussing what exactly is a lizard. Now that might seem relatively straightforward, and it kind of is, but it isn't, right? So we'll go a bit into that. We'll also talk about the habitats in the region, what makes it special. So we'll be focusing on Southeast Asia, as well as all of the appropriately associated species. We'll also be talking about unique adaptations of lizards, because we're in such a biodiverse folk town, something like that, right? So, but what about the ones without four legs? If you take a look at the ones at the top, they don't have legs, but they're still considered lizards. And if they are considered lizards, are snakes considered lizards? Let me just ask you a question. How many of you think this is actually a lizard? Just show of hands. Okay, a fair number of you. This actually isn't a lizard. This is known as a tuatara, and they are a very distinct lineage of animals. They are still reptiles, but they are not considered a lizard. Now, if we were to go back to this particular, that's not the most clear photo, but what's important and what I want you to focus on is this particular one circled in red. That particular clade, as we refer to, or group of animals, are snakes. This entire thing, they don't really look at snakes as part of the whole lizard taxa, because they are firstly very unique and they have very different behaviors to your normal everyday lizard. So let's talk a little bit about the diversity in the region. Southeast Asia itself has actually 11 different families of lizards. However, if we were to talk about all 11, we'll be here the whole day. So today I want to just focus on these 5 groups, and although they are less than half of the families available, they make up more than 90% of the lizard diversity in the region. So we'll be talking a little bit about skinks. They're usually your smaller animals that scuttle along the ground or climb up trees. We'll be talking about monitor lizards as well. These are the largest lizards in Southeast Asia, and the Komodo dragon is part of this family as well. We'll be talking about your common geckos, your common house geckos, and things you see on the walls fall in this group. The eyelet geckos are also a type of gecko, but the difference, we'll talk about a bit of that later. And finally, we'll be talking about agamid lizards. Right? So these are your garden fence lizards, the ones you see on garden fences, in parks, and on trees, things like that. So before we dive into the world of lizards, we need to do a bit of context setting, right? Let me talk a little bit about habitats in Southeast Asia. Much like the lizards and all other animals within this region, our habitats are extremely diverse, right? So today we'll just be focusing on 3: dipterocarp forests, freshwater swamp forests, and urban landscapes, right? Let me just go a bit into what they are. So dipterocarp forests are the predominant forest type in Southeast Asia. They are mainly dominated by trees in the family of Dipterocarpaceae, which are massive trees that grow up to 90 meters in height. And actually, the tallest tropical tree is actually one in Borneo, which is about 90 meters in height. And they also produce very iconic winged fruits. How many of you here know what a shoria is? Yeah, so a few of you do. So that shoria is in the same family as the imperial house. So this is what dominates our landscape. Now, because these trees are so tall and so unique, they actually have produced sort of like a co-evolved trait. So Southeast Asia is home to the highest number of gliding animals, right? And the theory behind that is because we have such tall trees, the amount of energy needed to crawl down a tree to another one and all the way up again is basically just a waste of energy, and it's not cost effective at all. Furthermore, gliding enables animals to quickly escape from predators if they are threatened or if they feel threatened, right? So in Southeast Asia, we have gliding lizards, we have gliding snakes, we have gliding frogs, gliding squirrels. We have even this mammal that's very closely related to primates known as the colugo. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it, but we do have it in Singapore as well. It's this big-ish mammal, it's about this size, that just has a very extensive skin flaps that enable it to glide from tree to tree. You can see them very commonly in Bukit Timah or the central nature reserves. They look very cool when they glide. It looks like someone threw a handkerchief. Yeah. So if you ever see one gliding, consider yourself lucky because it's not a common sight. So let's talk a little bit about our gliding lizards. So in Singapore, we have 3 species of them, and they have modified ribs which allow them to glide. And this is what they look like when they are gliding. As you can see, this one right here is known as the 5-banded flying draco. You can see actually very distinct bones inside its, this is known as the patagium. And those are its ribs. So basically it has evolved to be able to spread its ribs and the skin in between them to form sort of like a hang gliding parachute type thing to catch the air and actually glide. And there were a few studies done on how well and how accurately these guys can glide. And when you look at it, actually, if you see it in the wild, it seems like they're just jumping and randomly landing on a nearby tree. But the studies have actually shown that they are able to control the direction very, very well. So apart from having sort of like adapted ribs, what they have as well are these things, these protrusions that come out from their necks, known as the dewlap. Now, this is very important for species identification. Each particular species, the males, will have a specific color of dewlap. So the one on top is your Sumatran flying draco, is the most common one. And I bet you right now, if we go up to the car park, we will definitely find a few. So these are by far the most common, and you can see them in parks, in your HDB estates. Just look on trees, look for things that are sticking out from the trees. These other two are a bit rarer because they're only found in nature reserves and slightly more pristine habitat. So coming back to the dewlap a bit, the reason why they need so species-specific colors is because they use that as communication. So if you ever see 2 dracos on a tree, or even just a single one, and it's just on the tree and it's extending and retracting and extending and retracting its dewlap, it's communicating to potentially another individual, either on the same tree or on a different tree. Now, of course, that's how they argue, so to speak, how they communicate. That's not always how things are settled. But interestingly enough, as we all know, there's actually a lot of male-male combat in animals in general. These lizards deal with it a different way. What they do is basically they start doing push-ups if they are not able to resolve their differences, right? It's literally just to tell the other male, look at how fit I am, you do not want to fight me. So please go to another tree and do other things. Yeah. So it's actually interesting because they do vary quite a lot in sizes in terms of between species. The largest one is about, I believe, 15 centimeters across, not across, but 15 centimeters long without the tail. However, despite all of the size differences, they all feed on the same thing. They all feed on ants. So these guys are your natural pest control. The other ones keeping the ants in check in the forest. So these are your flying Dracos. So now that we've talked a bit about the canopy and what inhabits them, we can talk about something that's nearer to the ground. So monitor lizards, like I said before, they are the largest in terms of size of families within the region. Again, we have 3 species in Singapore. This is by far the rarest. It's called the Dumerils monitor, and to date, in Singapore, we only have 4 records of it. Yeah, so only 4 individuals of this particular species has ever been seen in Singapore. The reason why it's so rare is because it's found in one of the rarest habitat types in Singapore. It's found in swamp forests. And out of the original forest cover, 100% of our original forest cover, we only have about 0.1% left. And of that 0.1%, 0.01% of that is swamp forest, which is why these guys are so incredibly rare. They are also very common in pet trade because their juveniles have a bright orange head, and which makes them very, very attractive. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to keep them in Singapore, and you're not allowed to keep them legally as well. So moving on to the other 2 species, the ones that you guys will probably be more familiar with, the Malayan water monitor and the clouded water monitor. Now, these photos are a little bit sort of like, they are not to scale, because the Malayan water monitor is almost twice as large as your clouded monitor. They can grow up to about 3 meters in length, including the tail, whereas your clouded monitors only get up to 1.2 meters. And how they're both still around in Singapore is because of this thing known as niche partitioning. Basically, they inhabit 2 different microhabitat types, right? So, like its name suggests, the water monitor is more closely associated with water bodies and things like that. So you will find a lot of them near and around our nature reserves where there are reservoirs, right? So the Central Cape Nature Reserve, where there are quarries, you'll see a lot of them. And the clouded monitor is more of a forest monitor. You will see them in the forest and climbing trees. They are great climbers, so that's where you will see them. In fact, the best place you can see the clouded monitor lizard is actually the botanic gardens, because they aren't really hunted, or they don't really have a natural predator in Singapore apart from big eagles. So they are very, very popular within the botanic gardens itself. If you go in the afternoon, you can easily see about 20 of them just running around or just digging the ground and eating up the sort of like lizards, worms, and beetles. They also differ in terms of diet. Like I said before, the clouded monitor predominantly feeds on your worms, lizards, beetles, anything they can find in the ground, whereas your Malayan water monitor feeds mainly on carrion. So what carrion is, it's basically dead carcasses of animals that are found in the forest. Right? That's all that means. So they need a very, very strong gut, and they need a very strong immune system to be able to actually feed on what is essentially rotting matter. So how do you tell the tree apart, right? If you do see the Dumerils monitor, you can count yourself extremely lucky. Like I said before, it is by far the rarest monitor in Singapore and one of the rarest lizards in Singapore. So you can see it has quite a fair bit of striations on the neck and a lot more sort of like pronounced scales. They are a lot more raised and they're ridged. So that's actually how you tell it, based on the patterning on the neck. So between your water monitor and your clouded monitor, there aren't really a lot of patterning differences. But remember I said they were niche partitioned, and you can actually tell that by the placement of their nostrils. So because the Malayan water monitor is so closely associated with water, it is a very, very good swimmer. And the placement of the nostril enables it to use its nose like a snorkel. So majority of its body will be underwater, and only the tip of the nostril will be above water so that it can still breathe. So these are the ones you will see swimming around most of the time. Whereas if you take a look at your clouded monitor, its nostril is significantly further back on the nose. And not because it doesn't swim, but because it's not as closely associated with water as your Malayan water monitor. Of course, if you ever see a huge monitor, that's very likely the Malayan water monitor. If you see a smaller one that's slightly more grey in color, that's your clouded monitor. So that's basically the differences. So let's move on to the next habitat type of freshwater swamp forests. Like I said before, this is one of the rarest habitat types in Singapore. It is also not easily accessible in the rest of the region for a couple of reasons, right? So firstly, it's a swamp. So if you go in, it's difficult to traverse and you need specialized equipment like waders and things like that, and waterproof everything, so that you don't just sink into the swamp and you can't really explore the rest of it if you're sunk in the swamp, right? For the rest of the region, apart from there being freshwater swamp forests, there are these things called peat swamp forests, right? Where it's literally thousands upon thousands of years of fallen logs and fallen trees that make up the entire waterway, and because of that, the water is literally black, right? And it's a very rare habitat because a lot of the time it's drained, and because there's so much organic material there, it's really good for crops. So what happens in a lot of parts of Malaysia and Indonesia is they will drain a peat swamp forest and then build a oil palm plantation over it, or a pineapple plantation, or rice, things like that. So this is a very rare habitat type, and because of that, the animals found within it are also rare, or more uncommon, I would say. So the first one we'll be talking about today is the Singapore bent-toed gecko. Now, that is its common name, and if you take a look at its scientific name, Cetodactylus majula, right? This species was described from specimens taken from Singapore in 2012, and like I said again, it's found in swamp forests. It is active at night, and it's named Majula not as a nationalistic thing. In fact, the person who named this species is actually American. So why he named Majula? Majula, I'm sure a lot of you know, means forward in Malay. So it is actually named for the advancement of science. More specifically, it's named after the advancement of the research of this particular genus of geckos. Now, why it's called the bent-toed gecko? Now, you guys, a lot of you, I'm sure, are aware that geckos are able to scale walls quite effectively with their sticky pads on their hands or their limbs. This one, however, because it's more associated with forested habitats and boulders and things like that, and actually the entire genus is associated with rocky formations and trees. So instead of having just sticky pads, if you take a look at its limbs, it has claws, and its fingers look like it's bent, which is why it's called the bent-toed gecko. And this particular genus of geckos is actually one of the most speciose in the region. Within the past 10 or 15 years or so, a few hundred species from this genus have actually been described. It is the third largest vertebrate genus in the world. To date, right, I checked yesterday, so there are about 350 different species of bent-toed geckos in the world. Yeah. So in Singapore, we have only about 5. This is by far, obviously the most common. The other ones are quite a fair bit rarer. So this is again found in your swamp forests. The next one we're going to talk about is something we're all very familiar with, is urban spaces in Singapore, right? So this is a photo of HDB flats and whatnot. And what I'm going to talk about are your common house geckos. So just a show of hands, who thinks these are the same species? Okay, who thinks they are a different species? Okay, about the same amount of people. So the correct answer is actually they are the exact same species. And I know these, you guys will be more familiar with this one as opposed to that one. The difference is this will be found in your urban spaces, so your homes, your parks, things like that, whereas that one will be found in your forests and more forested areas. This is called substrate matching, where geckos are able to actually change the pigments of their skin to more closely match the colors that they're on. So if you have white walls and a very pale house, you'll take on a much paler color. If your walls are more like tree bark or brown in color or darker in color, they'll take on a much more pattern and much darker color. So, of all four, we in Singapore, we have 4 species of geckos that are closely associated with homes. These are all the colors that you will see of what they look like when they're in the wild, right? When they're in a garden, when they're in a forest. They will all be pale and very, very light-skinned if they're seen at home. So you will definitely have seen these species in your homes. In fact, in the past 2 houses I've stayed in, one in Ang Mo Kio and one in Bukit Batok, we've had all 4 species in our house, right? Yes. So of course, I'm probably one of very few who would actually bother to go and check for the species because I find these things fun. And now you know what I've been doing during COVID. So let's go through them a bit slowly. So this is known as the 4-clawed gecko. It is actually the same species that we talked about earlier on. Its common name is a bit confusing because if you look, it actually has 5 fingers, but only claws on 4 of them, which is why it's called the 4-clawed gecko. And that is actually how you identify the species. So if you ever see one running around in your house and it has 5 fingers but 4 claws, it's the 4-clawed gecko. So going back to the other one, this is your flat-tailed gecko. It's very simple, very straightforward because it has a very flat tail. This one again is your spiny-tailed gecko. You can see it has quite a spinose tail. Now this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So I'm sure we all know that geckos are able to drop their tails when they're threatened or if you pull up too hard on it. And they're able to grow it back as well. Unfortunately for this species, the spines do not grow back. So how then do you tell them apart from the flat-tailed gecko and the spiny-tailed gecko? You can't really see it in this photo, but near the base of the tail, there will be 2 spines that never go away. So that's how you tell them apart. And the last one, in my opinion, is actually the most pretty one, is your mourning gecko. And you can see it has actually quite nice patterning on its back and a deep brown color as well. Out of all 4 of them, this is the one that tends to have the most pattern, even when it is pale in color and kind of looking like the one I showed you just now. What's special about this species is that it doesn't reproduce by sexual reproduction, right? They are able to basically clone themselves. So they reproduce by asexual reproduction. So when a female is ready to lay its eggs, it will find a corner, lay it, and the individuals that hatch from those eggs are genetically identical to its mother. So within this particular species, there are no males at all. All females and all of them are able to lay eggs. However, because of the way the eggs are laid, there are still populational differences in genetics. So if you look at the Singapore population and you compare it to some places in Indonesia, although they are basically the same, almost the same animal, they will still be genetically distinct, right? And there are, if you want to go into it, there's actually a type A clone, type B clone, and a few other forms of clones which have been identified within the scientific community. So why it's called the mourning gecko is because supposedly its call is supposed to supposed to sound very sorrowful, it's supposed to sound very sad. I personally have never heard it called, so I wouldn't know. And speaking of calls, this spiny-tailed gecko is the one that sounds like. So this is the one that produces the sound. And the Malay word for lizard, which is cicak, is actually named after the sound that this particular individual makes. So if you ever hear that, it's coming from this one. So remember I spoke a bit about the sticky pads of geckos. Have you guys ever wondered how it works? So this right here is a sticky pad of a spiny-tailed gecko. Those red things you can kind of ignore. Those are just mites and they're parasites that are on the gecko. And don't worry, the ones in your houses probably won't have them. This one was found in the wild. You can see very clearly, or not so very clearly, because it's not a very good quality photo, the sticky pad on the feet of the gecko. Now, they actually use an interesting physical phenomenon known as the van der Waals forces, right? Which is your intraspecific forces of attraction. What they're made up of, right? They're made up of these things called setae. And they're very, very fine hair-like structures. In fact, they're so microscopic that you need a very strong microscope to actually be able to see the individual hairs. And because they're so numerous, there are intermolecular forces of attraction allow them to actually adhere to surfaces. However, and this is an interesting fact that my friend found out, he found a gecko stuck in one of his non-stick pans, one of these during COVID, and he was just scrambling and wasn't able to get out. So these sticky pads do not work on non-stick surfaces. So things like Teflon and things like that. If a gecko drops in, it's not coming out unless you help it out. Yeah. So do check your Teflon pans when you get home. Yeah. Introduced species. They was introduced in the 1980s, and this species actually has been theorized to have been pushed out a native species of agave. Right, the green-crested lizard was a lot more commonly seen within our forests and our parks before the introduction of the changeable lizard. Now, they are sexually dimorphic as well, meaning you can tell apart males and females based on color. This one right here is a male that is in breeding colors. So every species within this genus, their males have breeding colors. In this particular one, they will have a bright orange head and a black patch at its nape. So females will be a slightly more drab, greenish yellow in color. So basically like the rest of the lizard minus the head. And next one, this is the green-crested lizard that was pushed out by your changeable lizard. As you can see, in my opinion, it's a much prettier lizard and it's native to Singapore. Unfortunately, because they're changeable lizard, they are starting to get slightly rarer, and basically they're only found within forested patches. So we can actually talk a little bit more about the unique adaptations of lizards. Can any of you tell me what's in this photo? And if you say lizard, that doesn't count because this is talk about lizards. Does anyone see what's in this photo? Yeah, so I see a few of you nodding your heads. So what you're looking for is actually a gecko that has extremely amazing camouflage. So its head is here, one limb is here, and the rest of the body is there. Can you guys see it? Yeah, so this is known as cryptic camouflage, and in fact this particular gecko is the one responsible for the other photo. So this is known as the Saba flying gecko, and as you can see, it has amazing cryptic camouflage on it. You can actually see a bit of protruding sort of like fenestrations on its body to break up the monotony in its body shape so it's not recognized on bark. It is only found on the island of Borneo, and like I said again, it relies heavily on cryptic camouflage, and it is nocturnal, so it only moves around at night, where its camouflage is the most effective. However, I recently went to Borneo, and all of the ones that we found, except for a few, they were in huts. So they were on wooden structures and they stand out a lot. And the reason for that is because these huts actually attract a lot of insects. So they go there to either lay their eggs or just as a resting site, which is what attracts a lot of geckos. And that is very often the case as to why there are so many lizards and geckos within our houses. They are actually a form of pest control. So they eat spiders, they eat flies, they eat mosquitoes that actually are present in our houses, right? So although this is called a flying gecko, it's not very good at gliding. When it jumps and tries to glide, it's more like falling with style. However, our next candidate, this one right here, the Cool's flying gecko, is a much better glider. This is native to Borneo, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Unfortunately, in Singapore, it's only found on Pulau Tekong. Right? So if you want to see this, you can go and enlist. Right? Or for those of you who are not yet done with your nest, you'll hopefully see them when you're in Tekong. So as you can see, it has significantly more extensive skin flaps on its body. You can see that one right there that really, really helps with how well it is able to glide. Not only that, it has greatly modified limbs as well. So you can barely make apart the individual fingers on this particular gecko because they are so well webbed. And if you take a look at its tail, they also have a very unique fenestrations which help with the ability of gliding, not only gliding but with camouflage as well. So these geckos will not be able to substrate match as well as your common house geckos. Right? These guys at most will get slightly paler in the day, but nowhere near as pale as the ones in your houses. So, another question for you guys. Have any of you seen geckos blink?
No.
So, no, I'm hearing a lot of no's, and that's fair enough because geckos don't have eyelids. What you're seeing here is known as the ocular scale. And you can actually see a little bit of dirt on it. So how do they then clean their eyes if they're not able to blink or rub their eyes, right? So what they do is they actually lick their eyes. So geckos have very, very sticky and long tongues to the point where they're actually able to remove any debris they have on their eyes. And when geckos are in the shed, they will actually use their tongue to kind of remove some of the shed and consume it as well. However, this is only restricted to your common geckos, right? The family we talked about. There are geckos, however, within the other family called the eyelid geckos who do have eyelids. Now, this one, if you can see, it is able to actually close its eyes. Yeah, this is known as the fox-faced gecko, and it is actually, or rather was found in Singapore. Unfortunately, it's considered nationally extinct. However, they are still found in Peninsular Malaysia, Borneo, and parts of Indonesia. And the interesting thing about this gecko is it was actually described from specimens taken from Singapore in the the late 1800s, and it was described from botanic gardens. Right? Unfortunately, now if you go to botanic gardens, you will definitely not see them because they're considered, like I said before, nationally extinct. This is, in my opinion, one of the best looking geckos because they look like they're always smiling. And if you ever have the good fortune to actually see them in the wild, unlike your other house geckos or chichards, they don't scramble around and don't run around. They actually walk very, very deliberately and slowly. So they are really a beautiful species to see in the wild. Yeah, if you want to see them, this isn't published, but scientists consider the Peninsular Malaysian, the population of Peninsular Malaysia to be a different species from that in Borneo. So if you want to go and see both of them, they're actually very beautiful. So this particular individual is from Borneo, and the difference is mainly in the eyes. So I want you to remember how this one looks like. And then, like I said before, this slide, this is how the Peninsular Malaysia one looks like. So it basically looks like they have a galaxy of stars in their eyes. Yeah. So another unique adaptation is by reproduction. So we are very used to seeing a lot of reptiles lay eggs. You know, geckos lay eggs. You've seen them on walls. You've seen them, hopefully not, but sometimes in your power socket and things like that. And by and large, reptiles and lizards do lay eggs. However, this particular species, and in fact potentially the entire genus, are one of the only species, actually this is the only recorded lizard species in Southeast Asia to give birth to live young. So they do not lay eggs. What happens, this is known as ovoviviparity, right? Where the eggs will form inside the mother and it will gestate in the mother, and when it's ready, the mother will birth them as live young. Right? So this is a very, very rare horned lizard that is only found in Borneo, and I have actually the great fortune of not only finding one, but seeing one give birth as well. And this is what the juvenile looks like. So this is a freshly birthed Bornean horned lizard. And within Borneo itself, there have only been about, I believe, maybe 9 sightings of this species. So if you really want to count it, we found the 8th and 9th record of this because it gave birth. Normally this is what sort of like agame eggs look like. What they'll do is they'll actually come down from the tree, dig some hole in the ground and lay the eggs, which is where the eggs will develop and eventually hatch. But not for the Bornean horned lizard because it gives birth. Now the next one we'll be talking about is your single-fingered larynx skink. Majority of the species we've covered today are ones that actually are found either in the canopy or on the forest floor. This particular species is known as a fossorial species, meaning it spends majority of its time either in the leaf litter or in the ground itself, and which is why it has very unique limbs. So as you can see, it's called the single-fingered larroot skink, and the reason for that is because it looks like it only has a single finger on each of its limbs. And the reason for that is because they don't need limbs to move through the ground or leaf litter very well. What they do is they just burrow using their head, and that's how they actually stay in the ground. And it is hypothesized that is how many lizards and legless lizards actually lost their limbs. It's because they are found in a medium which kind of like prefers things to not have limbs, right? So this is again a very beautiful species. It's only found in Peninsular Malaysia, endemic. And I saw this individual in actually Genting Highlands. Yeah. So there are quite a fair bit of threats facing our lizards within not only Southeast Asia but elsewhere as well. So the first one and the biggest one is habitat loss. Remember I spoke a bit about how much habitat is left on Singapore. If you don't have any viable habitat, the lizards will eventually die out as well. And that is actually why we do, in Singapore itself, we do have quite a few lizard species which are considered nationally extinct. The second one is poaching, but not so much for your pet trade and things like that. Usually what happens in the pet trade is the original few will be taken from the wild, whether or not it's with a proper permit, it's up to date and depends on the species. Poaching in this case is predominantly for traditional Chinese medicine. So as is seen over here, this is in Singapore, by the way. So this was seen by a friend of mine, I think in 2021, I believe in Chinatown, where she saw lizard, sort of like, I suppose, lizard satays, if you will, for sale, for the purpose of traditional Chinese medicine. And there is this species of gecko known as the tokay gecko, which is found in Bali, Thailand, and some parts of Peninsular Malaysia. And researcher friends of mine have said their populations have actually significantly gone down because of their prevalence within the traditional Chinese medicine trade, right? And the last one affecting them is, of course, climate change, because as global temperatures rise, reptiles are a bit more susceptible to temperature changes as well, especially those ones found in your mountains. So what will happen is, because the global temperatures are rising, the temperatures up in the mountains rise as well. And because they are not, montane species as they're referred to, are not adapted to lower temperatures, they have moved higher. And the only way is to go up and further higher in elevation. Unfortunately, there is a finite amount of elevation that they can go up by. So these are the ones that are facing our lizard populations. Now for the conservation, of course, reforestation efforts are important. For poaching, it's predominantly enforcement. That's usually how you will tackle the issue of poaching. And climate change, just look at your sustainable carbon practices, sustainable travel practices, and things like that to try and stem the increase of climate change. Yeah. So thank you all so much for listening. This is the end of my talk, and thank you for coming. So just a few interesting additional resources, and by the way, all of these slides will be emailed to you guys after the fact, so you don't worry about taking these websites down. So the first one is Ecology Asia. It's actually one of the better websites in the region for regional species, not only lizards, but all other reptiles, amphibians, and mammals as well. The second one is Reptile Database. This is a great international global website that has almost all the species of reptiles listed on there. So if you visit it, if you Google a specific species, this will be one of the results that come up. Now, I am from the Herpetological Society of Singapore, and we do offer free guided walks once a month. We usually post about it 1 to 2 weeks before the actual event. So you can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, and that's our website. We also do educational blogs and educational content once in a while. So thank you all so much for coming, and I'll be taking questions now.